does God require of us? Sometimes we get caught up in this idea of being a perfectly faithful person or just an always good person, but what is it that God requires? We're going to think about that today on Now What Devotions from Trinity Lutheran out at Scandia East in Cyrus. So this week, Jesus pokes a little pin in the balloon of righteousness, and the disciples are probably a bit surprised as he lays out for them today what it is that God might require and what God doesn't require. So we're in the book of Luke. It's still chapter 18, verse 9, and Jesus says, look at, see this Pharisee up here who's praying, and he says this, and he prays that way about how he's got it all figured out, and he's doing a good job before God, and he's feeling real comfortable in his righteousness. Yeah, don't do that. Be more like a tax collector here who comes and prays and sticks his head down and is deeply ashamed and then leaves. He goes back to God justified, is what Jesus says. Now, there's a lot going on in this verse. It is not as simple as Pharisees bad, properly guilty feeling sinners good. There's a lot more going on there. But to start, the biggest point I think if you were to take away to start from this is that saints are people, right? The saints that God loves, the saints that God saves, the ones that God justify, they're people. They're imperfect humans. They're not anything other than that. A lot of times when I'm preaching a funeral, when I'm getting stories from a family, I really try to ask them, can you tell me stories? I don't just need to hear good things. I just need to hear things. Can you tell me things about this person that were frustrating, that were hard to understand, things about this person that were contradictions, tough experiences they went through, how they made sense of the world? This, to me, is always more helpful in preaching at a funeral than, say, tell me every good thing they ever did. Because life isn't lived in only the good moments. It's lived in all the moments, right? And how God shows up in that is so much more important than just the parts we get right. We put up a stone to remember that people lived, not to memorialize them as perfect, not to make them into saints. Jesus today, he tells this story, and you have to remember, the Pharisees actually were righteous. Like, it's not that they were bad, or they were always, especially in the book of Luke and Matthew, they are set up as sort of like, here's one thing, don't do that, do this, right? But you have to remember that in Jesus' time and place, the Pharisees were the ones who actually were following the law for the most part. Other historical reports at the time, we have the Pharisees lived generally humble lives. They followed the law. They did the sacrifices. They did more than was necessary for sacrifices and fasts. They kept law and Torah. This is what God had asked of them, and they did it. And a lot of the general populace just didn't, right? So these people were actually, according to their version of it, righteous. And Jesus says, no. The Pharisees are human, like everyone else. They're doing the things, but if they miss the widow and the orphan, they are equally at fault. If they pray that they are doing better than everyone else, it's a lie. And even this tax collector, who, by the way, will go back to being a tax collector after he prays and sinning and skimming off the top all over again, even this guy receives forgiveness from God. And I hope you can hear in that what a sea change that is, compared to the idea of if you fulfill the law, God will protect and you'll be justified. This is completely different. Jesus is changing the game with his disciples. He's saying, no, this is about trust. It's about trust. God loves and wants to forgive. And even living righteous does not make you somehow more or less than those who don't live righteous. As faithful people, death is the great equalizer, right? After things are all said and done, we can remember the good or the bad about a person. We put up a stone and we remember that they lived and that they mattered. But ultimately, God brings them in. They're forever going to be made right. whole, complete. And if that is the truth of our lives, then when Jesus says, pray and be honest, acknowledge your humanity before God, keep track of that, we can do that. We can pop that balloon of pride that we have that we're doing things right, or the opposite, we can stop feeling so terrible all the time for being imperfect. And instead, there's a place of calm, peace, and trust that can come before God, saying that, yeah, we're justified by faith. That's an entirely different piece. That's your thought for today. Out at Scandia here, enjoying the beauty and the quiet, thinking about what is it to stand before God as human, saint and sinner, right? Law and gospel. I'm Pastor Chris from Trinity and Cyrus, signing off for now.